Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the Dr. Akash Show. Today's episode is super relevant to literally anybody listening or watching this platform. We're going to talk about fat. Now, fat gets a really bad rap, mostly because of marketing, but we're going to talk about what fat is, what's good fat versus bad fat, what does fat even do, why do we have it, and what you can do to maximize the good stuff and minimize the bad stuff. But before we get into that, if you can go ahead and like and subscribe this show, that would teach the algorithms on the platform that you're watching or listening to this on to get this out and expose this to more like-minded people like us so we can continue to provide value for free. So if you like the show, please hit like or subscribe. And if you find it valuable, please share the show as well. So let's get into it. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm a triple board certified physician in anesthesiology, pain management, and anti-aging medicine. I use my experience and my clinical training to really siphon and filter down all the nonsense and give you practical advice on what you can do to become fully optimized. So let's talk about fat. Let's get into it. So fat has gotten a bad rap, mostly because of marketing to get you to buy products that are labeled as non-fat so you can feel good about yourself. But before we kind of discuss that, I want to tell you a little bit about what fat really is and what types of fat there are. Did you know that we actually have 6 types of fat? There's essential fat, there's white fat, there's beige fat, there's brown fat, there's visceral fat, and then of course subcutaneous fat. Let me break down very quickly what each of these are. So let's start with essential fat. Essential fat is considered to be a good fat, and this is mostly used for hormonal regulation and regulating body temperature. Brown fat is also a good fat. Now, brown fat is typically used to regulate body temperature, and this is specifically why you may shiver in cold temperatures, because you're burning brown fat to maintain your core body temperature. Now, white fat can be good or bad depending on the quantity that you have. Now, in normal, healthy levels of white fat, this produces a hormone called adiponectin. And adiponectin is very important for insulin management, which ultimately helps manage your blood sugar. It also produces a hormone called leptin. Leptin is also very important for hunger management. 2 other major hormones are affected with the levels of white fat, and that includes growth hormone and cortisol. Growth hormone and cortisol are managed and affected by the level of white fat you have. These are also extremely important for overall growth and just kind of healthy functioning of your body. And cortisol specifically also contributes to blood glucose management. At higher levels, however, with white fat, you can start to experience things like insulin resistance. Now, what insulin resistance basically means is your body now has less and less of an ability to deal with high levels of blood sugar. So think about insulin like this. Insulin is basically a key that fits into a lock on your cells. Pretty much all of your cells, your muscle cells, your heart cells, your liver cells, your pancreas cells. And when you open that lock with that key of insulin, you allow blood glucose to travel into those cells. This is a good thing because blood glucose is basically our gasoline. It's what allows us to function as human beings. But the problem with insulin resistance is now that key doesn't fit in the lock as well as it used to. Maybe the key has been worn down because it's been used so many times, and now that lock doesn't necessarily open as well as it used to with that key. Now, what does that mean? That means now you have blood glucose just floating around in your bloodstream and it's not getting to where it needs to go. And that becomes catastrophic because that can cause all sorts of other changes down the road, which we'll talk about in a later episode. So ultimately, insulin resistance is not your friend. Think about that, okay? So high levels of white fat can increase insulin resistance, which is not good. Typically, white fat is stored on females in the thigh region and on males in the abdominal region. Now, so if you're dealing with high levels of white fat, treatment for that is to increase muscle mass, briefly stated, and I will revisit that in a moment. Beige fat. Beige fat is basically when a white fat is becoming more brown. So it's in the middle stage and it's beiging in essence. Now, beige fat is considered to be a good fat. It occurs when you have increased stress on the body in a good way, which means physical activity, physical fitness will increase this process. And finally, subcutaneous fat. So subcutaneous fat is the fat that we all think of when we think of fat. Subcutaneous fat represents 90% of your body's fat storage. And speaking of storage, this is considered to be a storage fat. Basically what that means is your body, when it deals with subcutaneous fat, it reflexively wants to keep that fat because it acts as a storage for energy reserves in the future if you need that, if you can't eat for a prolonged period of time, if you're stuck in the woods and you don't know where your next meal is going to come from because you don't know when you can hunt something coming your way, for example, which is the way, it used to be for us. So ultimately, this fat is the most difficult to lose because it is a storage fat, because your body wants to hold on to it. But the problem with this fat is it's normally good when it's at normal, healthy levels. But once it gets to become higher levels, higher than normal, you can have things like hormonal dysregulation. That's basically a fancy way of saying you can have certain hormones go up, certain hormones go down in a negative and unhealthy way. One of those hormones is estrogen. So specifically for my male followers, as you increase your body's subcutaneous fat, which basically will be your abdominal fat, your belly fat, as that begins to go up, your levels of estrogen will also go up. Who cares? Why is this important? Guys, this is super important. Estrogen is overall considered to be a very female-dominant hormone, very much like testosterone is considered to be a male-dominant hormone. Both females and males have both hormones, and they're essential for both females and males. But in essence, if your estrogen level starts to rise as a male to higher than normal or higher than healthy levels, it ultimately kind of feminizes you as a male. Things like gynecomastia may show up, which is basically man boobs. Things like emotional lability, which is basically crying at a Hallmark commercial or just being super emotional and not really understanding why, something out of character for yourself. Things like that may happen. But also, guys, more importantly than that, arguably more importantly than that, there's an increased link to certain cancers with higher levels of subcutaneous fat. I'm going to say that again. There's an increased link to certain cancers with higher levels of subcutaneous fat. It's more than vanity here, guys, right? Now, we always talk about a few things in my podcast here, which is routines and rituals leading to resilience, making you robust. So when we consider those factors here, this is not about vanity. This is about creating routines and rituals to keep you resilient. What does resilient mean? Basically, being resilient means you can face difficult situations physically, psychologically, emotionally, etc. All of that can really only occur if you're functioning at an optimal state as the optimized version of yourself, right? Now, in order to do that, you need to make sure your hormones are in check. If your estrogen is out of whack and your cortisol and growth hormone are out of whack as well, and everything's just thrown off, the moment you get hit with a serious problem, which we're all going to be hit with, physical, psychological, with your family, with your work, whatever the case may be, you're most likely going to decompensate and have an inability to deal with that problem in a very healthy way. What sucks and what's important to keep in mind, and we've all experienced this, myself included, is when you're at that unoptimized state and you're just trudging along, and maybe you're a little chubby, a little fat, but nothing bad has happened. You haven't noticed any consequences, so no big deal. And then boom, that life issue arises. Now what happens? Not only do you decompensate, right, because you can't necessarily deal with it, but you begin to now further enhance the problem because you're more likely to eat emotionally. You're more likely to reach for those sweet and salty foods that make you emotionally or maybe in that moment feel better, but you're only contributing to a greater problem of increasing something like subcutaneous fat, which also means you're ultimately increasing estrogen, you're ultimately increasing your risk to certain cancers, you're ultimately throwing off everything in your body, right? And so you're further propagating the problem by propagating the problem, okay? So this is a reason why when things are going well in your life, when you're at a highly resilient state, and you're feeling very, very robust, which for our purposes, we look at that as being a powerful man, being the optimized, most powerful version of yourself. Now, when you're in a place where all your ducks are lined in a row perfectly and you're doing the right things, you're not necessarily noticing positive consequences, but you've built yourself up as a man, and you know that you can withstand and withhold and resist and move forward and not break down and decompensate when that problem occurs, right? So when you're doing that and that problem occurs and you're in that highly robust, resilient state, you're not going to decompensate and reach for those sweet and salty foods. So you're not going to make that problem worse. Think about it like that. Think about it like, the more I take care of myself today, the more likely I am to be resilient and robust when that life problem comes down the road, which is going to happen. It is unavoidable for all of us. You probably are going through something right now, like most of us are, and understand you have the ability to become much stronger as a human being, much more optimized, resilient, and robust, so you can handle these issues physically, psychologically, etc. The other thing to keep in mind with subcutaneous fat, in addition to what we just talked about, is the greater subcutaneous fat you build upon your body, the physically larger you become. And if you start to become very physically large, you become deconditioned, right? Because you're not able to physically do as much. Your physical activity level will go down. You're increasing force and pressure on your spine and on your joints. So you could literally bend over to pick up a newspaper off the driveway and herniate a disc and end up in an office like mine. So there's multiple reasons here, guys, why it's so important to stay physically fit and maintain appropriate and healthy levels of subcutaneous fat. But what I really want to talk about is what happens when your subcutaneous fat is going up. You know what else is also going up? Most likely, your visceral fat. Visceral fat is a very fancy way of saying the fat between your organs. You can't really kind of grab a hold of this fat, or you can't really see this fat per se because it's deeper. But this fat is unequivocally bad. This is inarguably a bad type of fat, and we don't want this. What can happen is the fat cells around the pancreas, around the heart, around the muscle, they all begin to get larger. And when that happens, there's an additional strain placed on those organ systems and on those anatomical structures. Very, very bad. The other thing to keep in mind with visceral fat, when you have high levels of visceral fat, you're also increasing a hormone called retinol binding protein 4. And when you increase retinol binding protein 4, you are increasing insulin resistance. Like we talked about earlier, increasing insulin resistance is a very dangerous thing. You are knocking on diabetes' door at that point. Things might become irreversible, and the long-term downstream consequences of something like diabetes can be catastrophic and life-changing. So visceral fat is no joke. But check this out. Visceral fat also has a direct link to colorectal cancer and breast cancer. Visceral fat is also thought to be very inflammatory in nature, and because you kind of find it everywhere in your body, it increases inflammatory type degenerative disease states. Like what? Like Alzheimer's disease, like dementia, and like stroke. So visceral fat going up increases your risk of all of this. Ultimately, visceral fat going up increases things like, check this out, diabetes because of insulin resistance, stroke, Alzheimer's, dementia, cancer. I mean, this is all bad, guys, right? There's nothing good here whatsoever, but you can definitely avoid it. So those fats that we talked about, some are good, some are always good, some are always bad. A couple of them are right in the middle, like subcutaneous and white are kind of right in the middle, right? Brown fat's pretty much always good. Visceral fat is pretty much always bad. To keep all of these types of fat optimized and in healthy, normal ranges, it's all almost exactly the same, which is exercise. Physical activity exercise, and increasing muscle mass. All of these factors specifically correlate with maintaining healthy levels of fat. Now, of course, guys, there's supply and demand, there's input and output, right? So of course your diet plays into this quite significantly. Specifically with diet, what you want to focus on consuming, of course, track your calories and make sure you're not over consuming. But as you are consuming, what you want to focus on consuming is lean proteins like chicken, like egg, and like beans, okay? Unsaturated fatty foods like fish and like nuts. You want to avoid kind of fatty-based type foods that fall outside of that category. And guess what, guys? Like we talked about a couple podcasts ago, sleep. When you sleep well, you're also optimizing your fat metabolism and fat utilization. When you're sleeping well, that 7 to 8 hour window that you should definitely be getting, you're looking at your growth hormone levels being normalized, your cortisol levels being normalized. They improve your metabolism and they improve your ability to handle blood glucose and deal with your overall physiological balance. So routines and rituals, guys, let's break this down. Your routines and rituals, focus on 7 to 9 hours of sleep every single night. Do not take a night off. Do not blow off a day because you can make it up the next day. It doesn't work that way. Go back to my previous podcast to understand how you can sleep better. Track your macros. Make sure you understand how many calories you're taking in. Now, routines, physical activity. Physical activity is incredibly important. Develop a solid structure around your workout routine. Get 4 to 5 days a weekend if you can, a minimum of 3 days. Track it and measure it to make sure you're actually doing it. Don't just go off of how you feel. Make sure you're getting the work done. And we'll talk more about that in another podcast. Resilience. How do you maintain resilience? How do you face difficult situations and power through those difficult situations in life? You do that by maintaining this optimized state of yourself. You do that by focusing on what you're consuming, by focusing on how much you're exercising, and by focusing on how much you're sleeping. You do that by measuring your levels of fat, making sure your fat levels are considered to be normal and within healthy ranges. And being robust, maintaining a robust state, being the most powerful version of yourself. How do you do that? You do that by being resilient with the routines and rituals we've discussed. But at this point, to be really robust, you may also want to consider things like hormone replacement therapy or supplementation. There are certain instances where hormone replacement therapy or supplementation prove to be extremely helpful for increasing the fat burn and increasing muscle mass. So you can help kind of tilt the scale in your favor in that sense. We're going to break all that down in future episodes. So guys, I hope this has been helpful for you. Fat is much more than a vanity thing. It's really, really important for your overall health, minimizing risk of long-term disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, dementia. Think about yourself, of course, but also think about your loved ones. Think about your children. Think about your wife or whatever. Think about your family members that are really relying on you, that are counting on you, and that would be so incredibly heartbroken if something happened. It's bigger than us. It's the whole sphere of the people that we affect. If this was helpful for you, if you found value in this, please share it, please like and subscribe. And remember, the best day to do something was yesterday. The second best time is today. Don't live with regret tomorrow. Do it now. Take one step today. Thank you for watching.